The Supreme Court oral arguments in the landmark separation of powers case that would determine the constitutionality of congressional subpoena enforcement against executive branch officials claiming categorical immunity had drawn unprecedented attention from constitutional scholars, federal practitioners, and political observers who recognized that the court's decision would fundamentally shape relations for generations by either affirming robust congressional oversight authority or establishing immunity principles that could effectively prevent legislative examination of executive conduct regardless of evidence suggesting potential wrongdoing or statutory violations. Justice Clarence Thomas sat on the bench as the court's most senior associate justice and as its most vocal proponent of a constitutional interpretation that emphasized what the framers intended at the founding moment rather than how constitutional principles might evolve to address modern governmental complexity. His reputation as rigorous textualist who demanded that constitutional interpretation be grounded in founding-era understanding rather than in contemporary policy preferences, making him both revered by conservatives who valued fidelity to original meaning and criticized by progressives who argued his originalism was selective and outcome-oriented in ways that consistently favored conservative policy results regardless of whether founding-era materials actually supported those outcomes. Jasmine Crockett stood at the Supreme Court lectern representing Congress's institutional interests in defending enforcement of the disputed subpoena. Her appearance at oral argument representing the extraordinarily rare opportunity for a member of Congress to directly advocate before the nation's highest court for legislative branch prerogatives against executive claims of immunity. With her selection to present argument reflecting both her demonstrated expertise in separation of powers questions and the institutional judgment that her combination of constitutional knowledge and practical congressional experience would enable her to address the justices' questions in ways that pure academic advocates might not achieve. The oral arguments had been proceeding for approximately 45 minutes, with various justices questioning Crockett about limits on congressional authority when Justice Thomas had begun a line of questioning that was clearly building toward what experienced Supreme Court practitioners recognized as one of his signature moves, posing hypothetical designed to expose what he viewed as logical implications of opposing parties' position that the advocate would be forced to either accept or distinguish in ways that would reveal inconsistencies in their constitutional framework. Then Justice Thomas had interrupted Crockett mid-sentence as she was responding to his initial question, cutting her off to pose what he, clearly, believed was devastating follow-up that would force her to either concede that congressional authority had limits that contradicted her advocacy for enforcement or defend positions so extreme that even the court's liberal justices would recognize it as constitutionally untenable. His interruption delivered with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from 3 decades on the court and from conviction that his originalist methodology gave him definitive understanding of what the Constitution required regardless of what modern governance complexity might suggest. What Justice Clarence Thomas had catastrophically miscalculated was that Crockett had been preparing for Supreme Court argument with intensity and comprehensiveness that few advocates ever achieved, that she had studied not just the legal issues and precedent, but had specifically researched each justice's jurisprudence and questioning patterns to anticipate their likely challenges, and most significantly, that she had prepared specific response to Thomas's interruption technique that would not just answer his question, but would do so in the way that would silence him by proving through his own written opinions that the position he was implicitly attacking as constitutionally extreme was position he himself had endorsed. In prior cases when that position served outcomes he favored, delivered with such precision and with such direct quotation from his own jurisprudence that he would be left unable to respond, without either acknowledging inconsistency or attempting to distinguish cases in ways that would expose the outcome-oriented nature of his supposedly principled If you want to see what happens when Supreme Court justice interrupts, advocate with question designed to expose constitutional extremism, and that advocate responds by proving through the justice's own written opinions that he has endorsed the exact position he is now attacking. silencing him through exposure of his inconsistent application of originalist principles. Subscribe to this channel immediately, because we are going to examine every element of how what Crockett said next silenced Justice Thomas, and why this moment became legendary for demonstrating that even Supreme Court justices can be silenced during oral argument when their own jurisprudence contradicts the positions they are advocating from the bench. Thomas's interruption of Crockett had come during her response to his question about whether congressional investigatory authority had any meaningful limits. Thomas had posed an initial hypothetical about Congress investigating purely private conduct, and Crockett had been explaining why the hypothetical didn't apply to the case before the court. When Thomas had interrupted, Justice Thomas had said sharply, "Counsel, let me stop you there because I don't think you're addressing my question. My question is about the principle, not about this specific case. Under your framework, if Congress decides to investigate anything and claims it relates to potential legislation, does your position mean that courts cannot question whether that claimed legislative purpose is genuine or is pretextual?" He had continued without allowing Crockett to respond. "Because it seems to me that what you're advocating is essentially unlimited congressional investigatory authority, where courts must accept whatever rationale Congress provides for investigations, even when those investigations are obviously politically motivated harassment that has nothing to do with legitimate legislative functions. And I want to know if you're willing to defend that position, or if you acknowledge there must be some judicial check on congressional overreach." The Supreme Court chamber had been intensely focused. Justice Thomas had framed his interruption as exposing what he viewed as the logical extreme of Crockett's position, that courts could not scrutinize congressional motives, which he was suggesting was constitutionally untenable. But what Crockett said next would completely silence Justice Thomas. She had remained calm during his interruption, and when she responded, she spoke with precision that immediately captured every justice's attention. "You've asked whether my position means courts cannot question whether Congress's claimed legislative purpose is genuine or pretextual. Let me answer by quoting from an opinion you yourself wrote in United States v. Windsor. Your dissent." She had pulled out documents in Windsor. The majority held that congressional motive in passing the Defense of Marriage Act was relevant to determining the statute's constitutionality. You dissented from that approach, and here's what you wrote. "The majority's aggressive application of rational basis review is unprecedented and represents a distinct departure from our precedent. The majority's opinion repeatedly points to the political controversy surrounding the statute as evidence that Congress acted with improper animus. But we have never before treated political controversy as evidence of constitutional violation." You continued, "There are many entirely valid reasons why Congress might have enacted Duma that have nothing to do with animus, but the court refuses to credit those reasons, instead reading the statute through lens of suspicion about Congress's motives. This approach would make every politically controversial statute vulnerable to judicial invalidation based on courts' speculation about legislative intent rather than on statutory text." The Supreme Court chamber had fallen into profound silence. Crockett had just quoted Justice Thomas's own opinion, arguing that courts should not scrutinize congressional motives or question whether Congress's stated rationales were genuine versus pretextual. Crockett had continued, "Justice Thomas, in Windsor, you argued forcefully that courts should not inquire into whether Congress's stated purposes are genuine or are pretextual masks for improper motives. You argued that accepting Congress's stated rationales rather than speculating about hidden animus is what judicial restraint requires. That's exactly the position you just characterized as unlimited congressional authority when I articulated it, but it's your position. From Windsor, you can't argue in Windsor that courts must accept Congress's stated purposes without questioning pretextual motives, and then argue in this case that accepting Congress's stated investigatory purposes without questioning whether they're pretextual represents constitutional extremism." She had then delivered what would complete the silencing, and Justice Thomas, "This isn't the only case where you've argued for judicial deference to legislative judgments without scrutinizing motive. In your separate opinion in Trump v. Mapp, you wrote that congressional investigations are valid so long as Congress's purpose is related to its legislative functions. You didn't write that investigations must survive judicial scrutiny of whether Congress's claimed purposes are genuine versus pretextual. You endorsed facial acceptance of stated legislative purposes as sufficient. So the principle you're now questioning, whether courts should accept Congress's stated investigatory purposes without inquiring into pretextual motives, is a principle you yourself have endorsed when that principle served judicial restraint in contexts you supported. Your interruption suggests this principle is constitutionally extreme, but your own jurisprudence has endorsed this exact principle. The Supreme Court chamber remained in absolute stunned silence. Justice Thomas sat frozen, visibly unable to formulate a response. His interruption had been designed to force Crockett into defending what he characterized as extreme position. But she had proven through his own written opinions that he had endorsed that exact position in prior cases. The other justices sat in visible recognition of what had just occurred. Chief Justice Roberts appeared to be suppressing a reaction, clearly recognizing that Thomas had been silenced by his own jurisprudence. Justice Kagan was taking extensive notes, apparently documenting the exchange. Justice Sotomayor had a slight smile, seemingly appreciating that Crockett had turned Thomas's aggressive interruption into exposure of his own inconsistency. After several long seconds of silence, Justice Thomas attempted to respond. Counsel, Windsor involved different constitutional issues about Congress's authority under the full faith and credit clause, but Crockett had immediately countered, Justice Thomas, with respect, the principle at issue is identical. In Windsor, you argued courts should not scrutinize whether Congress's stated purposes mask pretextual animus. In this case, you're arguing courts must scrutinize whether Congress's stated investigatory purposes mask pretextual harassment. The constitutional context differs, but the question of judicial deference to stated legislative purposes versus judicial inquiry into pretextual motives is exactly the same. You can't endorse deference to stated purposes in Windsor and then reject that same deference in this case without acknowledging that your position on judicial scrutiny of congressional motives changes based on which outcome you prefer. In particular cases, that's not principled originalism, that's outcome-oriented jurisprudence using originalist rhetoric to justify preferred results. Justice Thomas had no response. He remained silent for the remainder of oral arguments, not asking any additional questions despite typically being active questioner in cases involving separation of powers issues. The remainder of oral arguments proceeded with notably altered dynamics. Several justices referenced Crockett's response to Thomas in their own questioning, with Justice Kagan explicitly noting that as counsel demonstrated in response to Justice Thomas's question, this court's precedent supports deference to congressional statements of investigatory purpose rather than judicial scrutiny of pretextual motives. When the Supreme Court ultimately issued its decision several months later, the majority opinion which ruled in favor of congressional subpoena enforcement explicitly cited Crockett's oral argument response to Justice Thomas, quoted her point that judicial scrutiny of whether legislative purposes are genuine versus pretextual would require courts to speculate about congressional motives in ways that the court's precedent had rejected. Citing both Windsor, despite it being Thomas's dissent, and Mazars as supporting deference to stated legislative purposes, Justice Thomas wrote a dissenting opinion in which he argued for more robust immunity protections for executive officials. Notably, his dissent did not address Crockett's point about his Windsor position, endorsing the very deference to legislative purposes that his dissent in this case rejected. Legal observers noted this omission as suggesting Thomas had no effective response to the inconsistency she had exposed. The immediate aftermath in legal circles focused intensely on Crockett's silencing of Justice Thomas through his own jurisprudence. Supreme Court practitioners confirmed that silencing a justice during oral argument by quoting their own opinions was extraordinarily rare, an extraordinarily effective form of advocacy. Constitutional law professors wrote extensively about the exchange as demonstrating the value of comprehensive preparation that included studying each justice's jurisprudence to identify potential inconsistencies that could be exploited when justices posed challenging questions. Legal commentators noted that Crockett's response had been particularly devastating because it had exposed that Thomas's originalist methodology was applied inconsistently, endorsing deference to legislative judgments when that deference served conservative outcomes in Windsor, but rejecting that same deference when it would support congressional oversight that Thomas's political preferences opposed. Several prominent conservative legal scholars who generally supported Thomas's jurisprudence acknowledged that Crockett had identified genuine inconsistency in his positions on judicial scrutiny of legislative motives. Some argued this reflected evolving views rather than outcome-oriented reasoning. But others acknowledged that the inconsistency was difficult to reconcile with claims of principled originality. For the Supreme Court bar, Crockett's oral argument became required study for advocates preparing for their own arguments. The consensus was that her preparations, specifically researching Thomas's jurisprudence to anticipate his likely challenges, and preparing responses using his own opinions, exemplified the level of preparation that effective Supreme Court advocacy required. Multiple Supreme Court advocacy training programs began using the exchange as teaching tool, with instructors emphasizing that while most advocates could not expect to silence a justice through their own jurisprudence, the principle of comprehensive preparation that anticipated each justice's likely questions and that identified potential inconsistencies in their prior positions was universally applicable. For Justice Thomas personally, being silenced during oral argument by advocate quoting his own opinions was rare and embarrassing experience. His subsequent questioning in other cases became noticeably more cautious about making broad statements that could be challenged through his prior positions. Some court observers noted that the exchange appeared to affect Thomas's relationship with congressional oversight issues generally, with his opinions becoming less willing to make sweeping statements about congressional authority limits and more focused on narrow holdings that didn't create vulnerabilities to being challenged through his prior jurisprudence. For Crockett, silencing Justice Thomas during Supreme Court oral argument through his own opinions represented perhaps the pinnacle of what rigorous preparation and strategic advocacy could achieve. Supreme Court argument was the most demanding advocacy forum, and proving that even sitting justices could be silenced when their own jurisprudence contradicted their questions demonstrated mastery of the craft. In subsequent interviews, Crockett explained that she had prepared for Supreme Court argument by studying every separation of powers opinion each justice had written or joined, specifically looking for potential inconsistencies that she could reference if justices posed challenging questions. She had identified Thomas's Windsor dissent as directly contradicting the position he would likely take in questioning about judicial scrutiny of congressional motives, and had prepared the quotation so she could deploy it precisely if he gave her the opening. She emphasized that Thomas's interruption had been the perfect opening because it allowed her to prove, through his own words, that the position he was characterizing as extreme was a position he had endorsed in prior case. The fact that he had no effective response and remained silent for the rest of argument confirmed that the inconsistency was indefensible. So, if this examination of how Supreme Court justice can be silenced during oral argument when their own prior opinions contradict the positions they're advocating from the bench has shown you why comprehensive preparation that includes studying each justice's jurisprudence to identify potential inconsistencies is essential for effective Supreme Court advocacy, and why even justices known for aggressive questioning can be left unable to respond when confronted with their own inconsistent application of supposedly principled constitutional methodology. Subscribe to this channel for continued analysis of moments when rigorous preparation enables advocates to silence even Supreme Court justices through their own jurisprudence. The Supreme Court oral argument where Justice Clarence Thomas interrupted Jasmine Crockett, and what she said next silenced him, was more than impressive. Advocacy it was demonstration that comprehensive preparation that anticipated each justice's likely questions and that identified inconsistencies in their prior positions could enable advocates to turn aggressive judicial questioning into exposure of the questioner's own jurisprudential contradictions. That even Supreme Court justices claiming to apply principled originalist methodology could be silenced when proven to apply that methodology inconsistently based on preferred outcomes, and that sometimes the most effective oral advocacy proves through justices' own written opinions that their questions reveal more about their own inconsistencies than about weaknesses in the advocates' positions.